Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Artist Talk with Amber Dawn Bear Robe. In the next 90 minutes, we will get to know one of the curators of our exhibition, Native Runway. My name is Maren Staudinger, and I work at the d.a.i. in Tübingen. I'm the cultural department, and I am now honored. Next 90 minutes, we will there's a technical issue. All right. Again, my name is Maren Staudinger. I work at the d.a.i. in Tübingen, and I am part of the cultural department, and I have the honor to moderate this Q&A today. Before we start, I would like to mention that on our website, www.dai-tübingen.de, you can find all of the upcoming events. You can also take a virtual tour throughout the current exhibition, Native Runway. So if you cannot make it to the d.a.i. in person, you can have a virtual stroll around. If you have missed any of our past events, you can go and check them out on our YouTube channel, which is d.a.i.tübingen TV. And to stay up to date, you can also subscribe to our social medias, and you can subscribe to our newsletter as well. And if you like what we do, we are always very happy about donations, and the link for that you can find in the description box below. So I am now very delighted to announce that we have a cooperation partner, which is the Indiana Inuit, and that's a North American film festival. And there are some changes to the festival. It's now going to happen online, I think, but we will hear more about that in a second. And yes, two of the festival managers are here to join us, Gunter, Lange, and Sonja Schierle. I'm happy that you're here. Thank you for being here. Welcome, and over to you now.
Okay, hello. Thank you for passing the word to me, Maren. First of all, I greet all participants in the online meeting and the viewers and listeners, wherever they are. I would like to thank the team of the German-American Institute for making this event possible. And I would especially like to thank Amber Dawn Bear Robe, our Indigenous guest from Santa Fe, and Erika Knecht, who both curated the photo exhibition Native Runway. I'm very happy to meet you, Amber Dawn, even if only virtually. It's really a pity that the pandemic unfortunately did not allow an event in presence. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed to see you next year at our festival. I would like to introduce Indiana Inuit, the North America Film Festival, in a nutshell. It was founded in 2004 by Dr. Sonja Schierle, who I'm also hereby greet very warmly, and me. The festival takes place every 2 years, and it's unique in Europe. In the meantime, it has developed from a pure film festival to a cultural event as music, dance, lectures, readings, discussions, and as today, the artist talk which takes place within the framework of the event. Our goal is to offer Indigenous artists from North America a platform to present their contemporary art, their worldview, their wishes and problems to an European audience through film, fashion, lecture, dance, and as well in song and discussion, for example, with our audience. From the beginning, we have always placed our festival under a theme, as we usually receive between 300 and 350 films submissions from North America. Having a theme makes it easier for us to select films. As you may have read, our festival theme this year is more than leather and feather. Under this motto, the festival celebrates the indigenous cultures of North America, far removed from Hollywood stereotypes. Fashion, just like film, expresses vitality, beauty, and diversity, which is evident from the powerful photographs of the Southwestern Association for Indian Arts Fashion Show being on exhibition at the German-American Institute Tübingen. Indigenous designers say, we use fashion as an expression of our history, our pride, and our power of resistance. Before I pass the word to my friend and colleague Sonja, who will talk about our collaborations and among other things, I would like to emphasize that our festival team is made up of nothing but volunteers who either have permanent jobs, are retired, or studying. This means that the planning and organization of the festival takes place mainly in the evening hours, on weekends and holidays. Moreover, it is mainly financed by donations. Many thanks for your attention. And now it's your return, dearest Sonja.
You have to turn on your audio. Perfect, thank you.
Thank you, Gunter, Maren. Thank you, everybody who is listening, watching, and a very warm welcome to everyone. Very warm welcome to Amber Dawn. Greetings from Stuttgart. This is where I'm here. And together with Gunter, I have founded the Inuit North America Film Festival. And I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I'm retired now, but I've worked for 30 years at the Anthropology Museum in Stuttgart, the Linden Museum. I was the head of education as well as the curator for the North America collection. And when we started, actually, we had the same idea. We knew there were contemporary Native films, and hardly anybody knew about them over here. And so we said, wouldn't it be nice to have a film festival? So that's how it all started. But then we said at the beginning, yes, we would like to create a film festival, but we also want to have a forum that is like a forum of cultural dialogue and exchange. And like Gunter said, culture has always been important for us. And right from the beginning, we had a team of volunteers, and also we cooperated with established partners from the area of film, culture, and education. And as such, the film festival has many partners, like, of course, the Linden Museum, where I worked, but also the German American Center in Stuttgart. And the film venue is it's the leading institution of adult education, VHS. And also UNICEF is a partner, university, we have 3 universities, we have schools, and last but not least, the d.a.i, the German American Institute in Tübingen. And we are really very honored that the d.a.i shows this very special exhibition this time. And this exhibition, which reflects your work, Amber Dawn. And so I'm very much looking forward now to the artist talk of this evening to learn more about your perspective, about your work, about your insights. Thank you very much for sharing this with us.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, well, thank you. I'm so grateful to be here. I wish I was there in person, but that's just the way this world is right now. I'm coming to you from my sunny office in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it's sunny, but it's very cold here. So I'm going to share my screen to show you some images. But before we do, I just wanted to make the connection with film, along with the fashion shows that I produce for the Southwestern Association for Indian Arts. And I want to say, I'm going to be saying SWAIA, which is the acronym for the Southwestern Association for Indian Arts. We have created films, short films with each runway with every year that we've done the fashion show. And I just wanted to share with you because I just received this last week. The last biopic that we did in Orlando, d.a.i, we won an Emmy, a regional Emmy for the film short that we did. So we're hoping our new film was is just being completed now, and we hope to submit it to some international film festivals, and hopefully we'll get some more awards and accolades for that. So yay, thank you, SWAIA. All right, so let me share my screen here. Okay. So here we go. This is the SWAIA runway. There's a picture of one of my dear friends and models. Her name is Fawn, and she is walking in an original Jamie Okuma in last year's 2021 runway show in August, or sorry, 2021. We're in 2022 now. So as you can see, and as I've been introduced, my name is Amber Dawn Bear Robe. It's a very long name. Sometimes it can be very confusing to people. So I just like to say Amber Dawn's my first full name, then Bear like grizzly bear, and then robe like a bathrobe. Then usually people understand. And I'm originally from Alberta, Canada, which is just north of Montana, from Siksika Nation, which is a very particular Blackfoot nation under Treaty 7. And my Blackfoot name is Many Butterfly Woman. Oops, hold on, there we go. So I just wanted to give you a very brief overview of fashion and Indigenous designers that I have worked with. This is Jamie Okuma, and she did a partnership, well, there's many Indigenous designers that partner, but I wanted to point out that a lot of people may think that Native fashion is new, and that is, or because it has been garnering a lot more attention recently. But I wanted to note Native fashion is older than America, and Indigenous fashion is much more than buckskin beads and leather. It is political, it is diverse, it is glamorous, but it's also ready to wear. There's not one way to define Indigenous fashion. This is one of my mentors, one of my friends. This is Virgil Ortiz, and I'm showing you this picture because a lot of the Indigenous designers that I work with, their work, it's not just strictly fashion, it's really this dovetailing and this overlap of art and fashion, contemporary storytelling. And what you'll see with a lot of the designers, and I'm writing a paper right now on this, is that each designer has a story. Each designer's creative process collection is based on a story connected to who they are as Indigenous people and artists. So SWAIA, the organization I work with, we've been doing the fashion shows. This will be our 9th year, but I want to stress SWAIA has been around for 100 years. We're celebrating our 100th anniversary this year. If any of you can make it, even to our online events, I hope you can tune in. This is a fabulous year, not only for SWAIA, but for other organizations that promote Indigenous art and artists. So SWAIA really had an anthropological roots, actually, where white non-native anthropologists thought that Indigenous pottery and rugs and art was disappearing. And so it was really founded on the Southwestern Association of Indigenous Arts was really founded on the local pueblos, their art. And I think what's interesting to note, at the founding of SWAIA, Indigenous artists weren't actually even allowed to attend the event. And it was very limited in terms of what constituted or what would be judged as being authentic, quote, original art. And this, so you have to, in 1920, in the early 1900s, at the turn of the century, Indigenous artists were kind of left out of the picture. There was anthropologists and curators that were looking at Indigenous art, but not looking at the artists who actually made the work. And this shifts to fashion as well, because in the early 1900s, after World War I and after the Civil War and World War I, America realized that they wanted independence and that there was no American design. American fashion was really tied to European fashion. And so in the early 1900s, there was this movement with anthropologists and art curators and people in working in the art field, the art and design field. There was a push for designers to create an American design language. So at this time, people are like, well, what is an American design language that is separate, that is our own? And so these designers were encouraged to go to natural history museums and other museums that had collections of Native art and specifically pottery and textiles. And these designers were then looking at these historical works that were predominantly made by unknown artists. And I think what's interesting about this time period as well is that these designers were encouraged to pick and choose what they wanted from Native art and material culture and form their own American language. So it was really this green light and this step-by-step on how to appropriate Indigenous art and culture for non-Indigenous purposes, which is interesting because that is still very much has a stamp on American fashion to this day. When you look at American fashion, a lot of times people might think of historical regalia such as this, but a lot of the Indigenous fashion that I work with and the designers who I support and greatly love their work and creative output are designers who are working in contemporary form with contemporary materials and contemporary format, as well as just really having a different presence and storyline than what may be expected globally. Here is an image of Jamie Okuma's collections, and this is quite a few years ago, but you can see here she has the Nantillium shell that is on these modern contemporary bomber jackets, and you have the Nantillium shell earrings, and these models are in a city setting. I'm not sure which city, but this is another designer I work with, Orlando d.a.i, and you can see his design, this designer sense is much different than Jamie Okuma. Orlando d.a.i, he actually lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, but his work is very handmade, avant-garde, haute couture. And I always look at Indigenous designers as the original haute couturists of America. Indigenous designers have been making one-of-a-kind original works before America has been, is now called America. Every stitch, stitch by stitch, bead by bead, even to the gathering the materials. But also I think what I want to stress is that Indigenous design and Indigenous couture, Indigenous clothing is always changing. It's never been stagnant, and culture is a living and breathing cultural entity. One of the first American Indigenous designers to really break this threshold and to bring contemporary Indigenous fashion into a larger dominant modern context is Lloyd Kivenu. He's also an educator, an artist, and he was one of the founders of the Institute of American Indian Arts. And what is, I mean, I could have a whole hour just talking about Lloyd Kivenu, but just to let you all know that Lloyd Kivenu is a really considered you could say the father of Indigenous fashion in America. Lloyd Kivenu was known for creating his own textile prints, and those are some examples of textile prints you see in front of you. You can see a color clash happening, but he would reference different Indigenous nations across Canada and the United States. That would inform his textile prints, and he was creating modern prints for the modern everyday person. He opened his own store up in Scottsdale before Scottsdale became the bougie high-end art place that it is now. And again, I show you this picture because this picture is from, and I don't have my notes in front of me, so I think this is the 1700s, I want to say, 1600s, but I wanted to show you an example. This is a drawing by David Kuzik, and just to show you how our Indigenous people across Canada and the United States have been very stylish, have been wearing modern dress, including modern materials since before contact and after contact. Here's another example of one of our early, what you could say, fashionistas and fashion designers. This is Carolyn Parker. She was known not only for the work and fashion that she created, but she really had a strong influence on the people around her, both native and non-native, in terms of style and decor. And this is in terms of going back to the Victorian days and looking at our original fashionistas and haute couturists. This is an example. This is these taxidermied feathered bird fans. And I wanted to show this because this is an example of how Indigenous artists and designers were always looking at and exchanging ideas with the non-Native European people who were coming to our lands. And it's not as if Native people lived in a bubble and, you know, just use the materials that were from their local region. Indigenous people were also just incorporating concepts and ideas that were being brought over from Europe, such as these high fashion feather fans. And at this time period, taxidermy birds were used by European women for these large, elaborate taxidermied hats, and that's a whole other fashion movement, which I think is really interesting. So when you think of Indigenous people, Indigenous art and culture, unfortunately, Indigenous people have really been stigmatized into this stereotype, which absolutely bleeds into and has a strong impact on Indigenous fashion and appropriation. Of course, this is appropriation comes in all forms, from old cartoons. This is Peter Pan, and you could have a million examples, but also you see Indigenous fashion being appropriated in clothing in terms of costumes in Halloween costume stores, but also on the runway. This was a very infamous example of this model. This is Victoria's Secret walking down, and I think this is in 2012, completely ignorant of what this Indigenous fashion, and this is not Indigenous fashion, this is Victoria's Secret appropriating. And kind of, you can see here, the model is wearing this long feather headdress combined with this turquoise, which is Southwest. The headdress is from the plains. So, and then you have this weird leopard print. So you have all these mixed messages of this Indigenous fashion, which of course is not Indigenous fashion. What you're looking at here are two non-Native mainstream ideas of what Native fashion is. Okay, so Native fashion is much more than that. There's a lot of power in fashion and language is brought to the runway. This is a tank top by OXDX. Native America discovered Columbus. And so what you do is what we see now with Indigenous designers, not all of them, but some Indigenous designers are reclaiming the narrative of Indigenous fashion, and through literal text or through different design and fashion creations. This is the designer, Catherine Blackburn. She's actually from Eastern Canada. I'm showing you this image because Catherine Blackburn is an artist who's really pushing the boundaries and the lines, blurring the lines between what is fashion and what is art. And I think that's an interesting concept when you ask that question, because Indigenous art and design and clothing and food and that was a very integrated part of Native Americans' lives. And I hate to generalize, to say something over general, but this is from my perspective. And keep in mind, each Indigenous nation, culture, clothing, food, etc., is so diverse when you look at all the difference of regions in Canada and the United States. This is one of the first fashion shows that I did for SWAIA. This is outdoors. This is Jamie Okuma's designs that you see walking in the outdoor runway in Santa Fe Cathedral Park. This is another design by Jamie Okuma. If you cannot tell, I'm obsessed with her and her work. And this is Virgil Ortiz. I'm showing you this image as well to just really give a sense of each designer has a story that they are not only executing through their fashion, but also through art, and how there really is, for some artists, this is Virgil Ortiz, really exploring his narrative as a Pueblo, Coche de Pueblo man, looking at not only the past, but how the past is connected to the present and informing the future. This is Shosho Esquaro. She is a Canadian designer, and she's somebody who will be in this year's fashion show. And let me stop sharing my screen here. So before we go to the comments and questions, I just really wanted to present that as just a very, very smidgen, small, brief overview of Indigenous fashion and people that I'm working with. But I really want to emphasize that Indigenous fashion is so, how many times can I say Indigenous fashion? Native fashion is a huge, complex platform for creative talent, for artistic expression. And it really, each designer is just like designers in Germany, each designer has their own trademark, their own special, their own muses. And I cannot speak for all Native designers or artists. And I'm really coming to you from my perspective of a fashion show producer for the Southwestern Association for Indian Arts. And so keeping in mind that there's a lot happening in Canada. And so I'm trying to keep my finger on the pulse with everything that's happening in Canada and bring that excitement also to what's happening in America. Okay, that was a lot.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It was very colorful and interesting as well. So we have a lot of questions. And we're going over to the Q&A now. The first one would be, why are you drawn to Indigenous fashion?
I think that's very, well, I'm an Indigenous person. I'm a Native person. And I do get asked this question quite a bit. Well, how did you get involved in this? I actually, first and foremost, I'm an art curator. So I went to art school and I wanted to be an artist, but I just don't have the skills that are needed to be a successful artist or fashion designer. And so my art curation, my research, I also teach Native American art history. So I teach 6 different classes of Native American art history. That's Native American art history, historical and present, contemporary, but also the history of Indigenous fashion, 1940s to present, history of international Indigenous art and photography. So my point is that my world is Indigenous art, culture, and fashion, always has been. I grew up in that environment. So it's nothing that I had to seek out. It was just me, it's my environment, and it's just always been who I am.
So you also mentioned SWAIA, and there was a question of, are you happy with how everything is going, or is there something that could still be improved concerning SWAIA?
Oh, there's many things that can be improved. 100, just because we've been running for 100 years doesn't mean we have all the I's dotted and T's crossed as you would think that we would. But it is interesting because SWAIA did start from a very non-native anthropological value system, in which now the value system has shifted to focusing on Indigenous representation and Indigenous artists and their voices. And what does that mean? And how do we represent them and not limit that expression, but yet still have this prestige that SWAIA market does have. And I will say we are a not-for-profit organization as well. So money is always, we're always, show me the money. And in America, we just don't have the funding or sponsorship system that other countries do have. And so for me, I will say for the fashion show, this is only the 9th year in the spectrum of SWAIA's 100th. And fashion shows are not made to make money, right? Fashion shows are marketing for the designer. So I'm always looking for a major sponsor. So if there's anybody out there who would like to be a major sponsor for the fashion show, that's how at least my component and how that can be better in terms of the fashion programming. I will say one thing too, what I'm working on right now is developing a SWAIA Fashion Week, where it's not just one day, it's not just 2, but it is a week to really celebrate the diversity of Indigenous designers out there. Because I have to say, I have a limited time, a limited space, a limited budget, and I'm like showing just a tiny fraction of designers who I know really want to be on the runway. Because at this point, the SWAIA Fashion Runway is the largest runway, the largest fashion show featuring Indigenous designers in America, at least in America. It's different up in Canada. So I'm really wanting to expand SWAIA fashion. And that means, of course, that means money. So things can always be better. And I'm always trying to fine tune the fashion show. And something too I'm wanting to improve on, or for the future direction of SWAIA fashion, is to have an international Indigenous fashion, and not that I go international the runway, but that we bring international Indigenous artists to the SWAIA platform for a SWAIA Fashion Week.
Okay, great. So you mentioned that there is a lot of variety among the Native American artists, but what would you say, which Indigenous artists and curators do you think are doing, in your opinion, the most innovative or most interesting disruptive work nowadays, and why do you think that?
Okay, I definitely think I have so many artists I could name, and so many fashion designers I could name. And so these are just individuals who are just coming to percolating at the top of my head, but it's going to be, I'm going to, name the designers who are, Jamie Okuma. She is someone who is really pushing the envelope, but not only in the couture world, but also the ready to wear. Because I can't afford all of these one of a kind couture pieces. So it's nice that these designers and Indigenous designers shouldn't be limited to, should have a business, right? Artists need to have a business. To make money, right? That's the way the world works. So Jamie Okuma is someone who I just really admire in terms of having that haute couture collection, but also being a businesswoman and having a ready to wear line that's accessible internationally. And in terms of visual arts, so I have to say Catherine Blackburn. She is an artist, but also works with fashion and has an amazing voice in terms of what she is saying with her fashion. It's not just, and that's what I have to emphasize again, is that each designer that we look at, each collection, there's a story behind it, and much different. And I'm going to say different than just a designer. Of course, every designer makes a collection that has a story behind it. With the Indigenous designers that I work with, at least, their stories are connected to who they are and to their land and to where they're from as a Native North American, and looking historically at, not all of them, but sometimes looking historically at their own stories, personal stories, their generational stories, and not needing to look out, not needing to seek out to find a muse to inform a collection. The stories are very much tied to who they are as artists, as Indigenous artists. And for example, when you see geometric designs, is more than just a geometric designs. There is a coded language behind that geometric design, rather than what the world may see as, oh, the Southwestern style. If you think of the Southwestern style, at least this is what we think of in America, you have a very clear vision of, big turquoise and cowboy hats and big boots and, a peachy sky. And that is the generic Southwest. When you look at the Indigenous Southwest from a Native designer's perspective, it's much different. So I didn't give any names because there's so many names I could announce. And you know what I will do before we end? I will announce the designers who will be in this year's fashion show. So that'll just give you an idea of who I'm working with.
All right. So I know you said you don't like to mention a lot of names, but keeping it in that realm, you talked about people that you admire. You talked about Lord Keevaneu. Do you think you can say that there is a role model for you within the Indigenous fashion world? Someone you look up to?
I have to, I look up to the designers. Like, I really look up to the designers and what they do and what they can create, and their technical skills are amazing. And so I really look up to the designers. But when, again, to highlight, or to go back to, I did start my career in contemporary arts. So I want to say that some of my biggest mentors are actually in the Indigenous contemporary art field, which is Leanne Martin. She is one of the first Indigenous female curators who co-curated an exhibition in 1991 called Indigeneous. And so she's really a groundbreaking curator who brought the voice of contemporary Native art onto a global platform, whereas before, Indigenous artists were kind of relegated to either historical museums or anthropological museums or galleries. And it's not until the 1990s where you really saw this surge of Indigenous voice beyond that kind of glass ceiling of buckskin beads and leather. So Leanne Martin is definitely someone who I can say has been a huge mentor for me, still is, even though we don't live in the same country, but I just admire her work, her writing, her curation, and everything she has done for Native North America art, Native North American art.
Right, thank you. A whole other question about the art pieces or the fashion pieces themselves. Do you think that, or how did Native American fashion change throughout the years, or has it changed at all? Is there a difference from back in the day to now?
Right. So I guess it means, what do you mean back in the day? So that question, and I think that's an interesting question, because yes, fashion is always changing. I mean, can you imagine wearing the same thing every day for 20 years? No. So fashion is always changing. I think it's interesting when people ask Indigenous designers questions. I'm like, well, would you ask an American designer that? And I only pose that question back because why are Indigenous designers or Indigenous fashion? The reality is fashion is always changing. Culture is always changing. And that's what I'm really trying to get across here, is that even historically, when you look back, pre-contact, Indigenous art, customs, language, everything, food. There's North America has one of the oldest trading routes. We have one of the oldest trading routes in the Southwest here in terms of Chaco Canyon, from South America to North America, where we were trading items and foods and materials and feathers, and that absolutely informs and changes style and everything of a culture. Why, for example, if you're going to make a piece of pottery, well, I would rather use an electric kiln rather than have to do it with fire, and life is made easier with technology. So Indigenous people absolutely have always incorporated technology historically and presently to inform their collections, which are always changing. And I want to point out one thing, because you asked about my mentors. And I think it's very important to point out, and if you don't know who this individual is, please seek out Jessica Metcalf from Beyond Buckskin Boutique. She's online, and she really is one of the leaders. She received her PhD, I want to say 2010, and was one of the first Indigenous scholars to look at critically Native fashion. And so she really is a leader in the field, and one of the voices out there supporting and in fact, she's worked with me every year for the SWAIA Fashion Show. So she's absolutely somebody to look at and to visit her website, because she is a place where you can go and buy online and support Indigenous fashion artists and visual artists.
So you just talked about the technological part and how Native Americans always try to include technology and tradition. Would you say that goes hand in hand, being innovative, but also keeping the tradition alive through fashion as well?
Yes, and I have to be careful because I don't want to give a general answer, and I don't speak for all Native. In fact, I don't even speak for the designers. I'm not a fashion designer. I so wish I was a fashion designer. But so I want to, be very aware of, I don't speak for all designers, but the designers that I work with, there is definitely a thread of their collections being informed by who they are as Indigenous people. So it's really bringing, as I keep saying, culture is a living, breathing entity. It's bringing that culture, that history of who they are as an individual Indigenous artist into fruition with their designs, and that really varies. But yes, most of the designers I work with, they are absolutely bringing who they are as Indigenous people into the fashion forward movement.
So it's like a very personal thing as well.
Yes, but you got to look at that. Designers do create, until you get into these big houses and you have someone, who's doing the collection for your, Valentino or whatever. It is very personal and unique to each designer, just like all designers, unless if you're a huge corporation that's pumping out, mass-produced T-shirts. Each designer definitely has their own personal narrative to what they create and to why they create it.
Of course. One of the questions which I think is very interesting as well, and it might be hard to answer that, but what is your view on non-native people wearing Indigenous fashion? Do you think it's cultural appropriation, or where are the limits, or what is right or wrong, so to say. So what's your opinion on non-Native, especially white people wearing Indigenous fashion? Is it good because they support Native American fashion, or is it a bad thing causing cultural appropriation? Because you talked about Victoria's Secret before, but let's say I would buy from an Indigenous person, would that also be cultural appropriation if I would wear Native fashion in that way?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and it's a very complicated question, and it's a very heated discussion. It has been. For example, in 2012, I think Paul Frank was called out by Jessica Metcalf for appropriating Native design. So Paul Frank, you have to understand, is like a huge corporation that just went in and picked and chose, this geometric design, this feather, this thing, and I'm going to call it the Navajo panty, right? Where you're like, okay, this is not Navajo, and it's not even a Navajo design. That is straight appropriation. And so let me articulate that again, because I have heard this too, where people are saying, well, we're acknowledging, we're honoring you. And I'm like, that's not honoring. And I know cultural appropriation happens globally, but what I want to say, what's particular to Native North America, is that Americans have come in and picked and choose what they want from Indigenous cultures in many different levels, and then said, okay, well, this is American, and we're highlighting our appropriated Native people, that they're not actually people. It's just, this is Native American, this is Indian. Meanwhile, there's no understanding of the history of Native North America. So what you see is people are going back and looking at African American history of like, oh, America was founded on slavery, which is not true. America is not looking back further in terms of the founding of America is really on the genocide and assimilation of Native North Americans. So when it comes to assimilation, there's a difference when a huge corporation, such as Ralph Lauren, is infamous for being the symbol of American fashion, but he has constantly, continually picking and choosing, creating these Southwest Indian designs, which are complete appropriation. So when you're saying, if I buy a Jamie Okuma, is that appropriation? No, absolutely not. And so these designers, the designers that I work with who are making contemporary dress, contemporary clothing for the modern fashionista, they want to be dressing every color, every size, every age. That's not appropriation. When we talk about appropriation in the fashion field, it's a much different thing than supporting and buying from the designers. Does that make sense? And in fact, people, my colleague and friends, we encourage you to buy straight from the designer and to not buy from appropriated corporations that are completely just ripping off native design.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if there's big corporations that are appropriating, it has an even bigger impact on smaller fashion designers in general. But do you think if white people buy from Native Americans and buy fair fashion from them, do you think it's all right for them to wear the fashion?
Absolutely.
That was
absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I guess I didn't make my point clear. There's a difference. Buying straight from the designer, that absolutely, there's nothing wrong with that. I think what it is when people go and maybe buy historical regalia that was used for ceremonial purposes, that's something different, right? The contemporary fashion that are being created by present day designers is meant to be worn and by all.
Okay, I hope that answered the question from the chat. If there's further questions about cultural appropriation, please keep them coming in the chat. Kind of keeping it in that realm, what do you think are misconceptions that people have about Native American art and fashion? And before you said that art and fashion go hand in hand, which we saw in your images as well. So do you think people have a lot of misconceptions? And if so, what are the most common?
There's a lot of misconceptions, and I experience that even when I'm traveling within America. Recently, I went to Art Basel in Miami, and it was shocking the questions that I was asked in terms of basically comments such as, I didn't even know Native Americans made contemporary art. And then what does this art look like? Well, I can't give you an answer for what all contemporary Native art looks like. And that to me is a misconception, is that you can define Indigenous art and culture and style and fashion into one neat package, and I can present it. That's impossible. When you look at the landscape, the vast landscape of Canada and the United States, that's a huge land base, but also environmental differences. When you look up at Alaska, where it's snow and ice and wildlife, there's like polar bears and grizzly bears, and a much different environment compared to when you go to the Southwest, where I am now, where it's a high desert. There's rabbits, there's a different wildlife compared to when you go to the Pacific Northwest coast, where it's cedar trees and fish and salmon, compared to, on and on and on. So each region informs a different cultural, artistic, visual practice. Does that make sense? And so I think the misconception, especially and even within America, is A, I didn't know Indians still existed. B, the misconception that Native people don't do contemporary Native art and contemporary art period, and that Native artists should stick with doing buckskin beads and leather. And I think another misconception is that I think there's many. But I think to come to an understanding, or to come to a larger awareness, is to have programming such as this, to invite Indigenous artists and designers to the table, to dispel, to untangle those misconceptions.
Definitely, yes. Okay, the next question would be, well, we said there is, or you said that there is this artistical aspect in the designs and in the forms, but do you think, would you say that it is also a political statement, how Native Americans choose their designs, or is it meant for people, for non-Indigenous people to understand these statements if they are there, or are they just meant to be in between an exchange of Indigenous folks?
And again, it's going to really depend on the design and the designer and the garment that you're referring to. I did show some works that had some, no apologies necessary. Columbus. There are political works out there that are very political in your face. But then there's some designers whose work you may look at it and it is an encoded language that you don't understand. And maybe it is a design and a language that's only understood by the designer, or maybe by that designer's Indigenous community. So I can't give an answer that's going to be for all, but it's across the board, basically.
Okay, and next question is, how do you pick the models? And if you have them, whenever you have them ready, do they have a say in, let's say, their hair or makeup?
No, the models do not have a say. Just kidding. Of course they do to a certain point, but the designers, and I want to emphasize this, the designers pick the models based on whatever story they are presenting for the runway. And also the sizes that they need, and also specific gender or non-gender that they need. So we're very conscious. The designers I work with are conscious of having a diversity of models. They don't have to be Indigenous. They range in colors, size, age, gender identity, and that really is determined by the designer, because I want to support the designers in what they are doing and their story that they're bringing to the runway. So I may offer some suggestions in terms of the actual how the runway will be choreographed, but it really is the designer who determines this. And then with hair and makeup, that's also determined by the designers. And so what I do is it is a lot of work. I kind of do this model management. I get all the model cards in for all the models who would like to walk the runway, and the designers pick.
Okay, so the next question is, do you have one or two highlights that you experienced in your career as a curator?
Yeah, I'll say the one that instantly came to my mind is the very first fashion show I produced for SWAIA. It was outdoor in the Cathedral Park. And so when you do a fashion show outdoors with no budget, you're dealing with the elements, you're dealing with, there's a lot of unknowns. But I didn't even think to factor in, and it's hard to explain market, but during the week of market, the Central Plaza City is packed with artists and people. And, pre-COVID, you're like shoulder to shoulder. And I'm like, how am I going to get these models from the SWAIA building to Cathedral Park, because there's like a sea of people in between all that. So I ended up putting, we had a U-Haul, so I had a U-Haul, and so I put all of the models into the back of the U-Haul truck, shut the door, so they're in the pitch black, and they were driven to the runway. And that was a very funny, but also a pivotal moment in the SWAIA fashion runway, in terms of we need to think of those technical issues. Those technical issues are very important. And I think just another and every year there's a really special highlight, just in terms of every year it's a show that cannot be reproduced, and they're all unique from one another, including whoever's opening the show. So I just have so many special highlights I could share, but it's a very fulfilling experience at the end of each runway.
Okay, someone asked if it is possible for us in Germany to buy from Indigenous folks, to buy fashion from your,
the designers?
To buy fashion from your designers, if we don't live in Canada or the US. And
that I should have asked the designers before I came on the Zoom here. I'm going to say yes, but I don't know. I don't do the shipping. So it really depends on the designer's shipping capabilities, or not capabilities, but whatever they have in place. I'm not sure what the international, I don't know how that works, but there's no reason why you can't go to their website. All of the designers that I work with have websites. You can go to, you just Google Jamie Okuma, and I'm more than happy to give I will announce the designers who I'm work with, and just Google them and be like, hey, I want to I don't see why not.
All right, great. So I think we're going towards the end. I have one more question, which is a nice question for the end as well. What are your hopes and wishes for the upcoming years in regards to the Indigenous Fashion Week, maybe in Santa Fe, and just in general for Indigenous fashion?
My hope and my ambition is for Indigenous fashion to have a larger international reach and not stay within this Southwest kind of native bubble, but to really have a larger presence nationwide across America, and where it's, you know, you can see Indigenous designers on Entertainment Tonight or these other public fashion platforms. A quick note is just recently the Met Museum, which, if you're not familiar, is a major art institution in New York City. They had a fashion show, their recent Met Gala and major exhibition was called America Fashion Lexicon. So I kind of tongue in cheek had my slides start with that, because the Indigenous designer was completely omitted from that. There is one designer in that complete narrative of American fashion. And if you remember what I said at the beginning, Native American design was actually what informed an American design language. And so my goal is for Indigenous fashion to be at the Met Museum, to be in the public discourse of American fashion, period. And then for a personal goal is that I get some big sponsorships for my SWAIA Fashion Weeks.
It's interesting because just in that second, another question came in which said, should Indigenous fashion become more mainstream? Which you basically answered.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That is the goal, to be in Vogue Paris, to be Vogue America, to have an international presence rather than just a small little niche, misunderstood existence.
Yeah. And I think if that is going to happen, we'll also have an easier time buying Indigenous fashion from across the country.
Absolutely. Right. And this is a thing, it takes money. It takes money to get these things on a larger platform. And that's business.
Of course. Yeah, as everything is.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll give the word over to you in a second. I first of all wanted to say thank you so much for a very interesting evening, very interesting event. I just want to put emphasis again on the fact that you can visit us at the d.a.i to watch the images of your shows. And also we learned about the Indiana in Wheat Festival. I also want to say thank you to Gunter, Lange and Sonja Schierle again, and for the cooperation. And we hope to see you again at the d.a.i. Thank you so much for the insight, and I hope I could answer everyone's question now. I give over to you. You wanted to introduce the artists, but I wanted to
thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm launching a new a different component to the website where you can get all the information on the designers and Indigenous fashion. Hopefully by the end of next month, you'll be able to go to SWAIA's website to get a full view and insight into what we're doing with the Indigenous fashion SWAIA runway. The designers, I won't give all of them away. I'll give half of them away. But it's Jamie Okuma, Orlando Dugai, Catherine Blackburn, Leslie Hampton from Canada, Shosho Esquaro, and let me give one more. Oh, I'll give one more. And this is Cody Sanderson. He is the designer of this ring. He's a local, he's Navajo, a local artist, but he does do a very rare and unique, one-of-a-kind runway shows. So he's going to be on the runway this year. Cody Sanderson, check him out. He does he does rings for the rock stars, American rock stars and actresses. So I'm very excited for this year's fashion show. SWAIA's 100th year anniversary. Please, in about a month, come and check out Google SWAIA Fashion, and we'll have a full presence and announcement and insight into this year's runway.
We will definitely all do that. Thank you so much for being here. And with that, we're ending the talk. And thank you all for listening. Thank you for your questions as well. And have a good night.